Well, good afternoon, everybody. So I've been with the Waste Contractors and Recyclers Association for 15 years. On Monday, the Waste Contractors and Recyclers Association turned 70 years, and we're the oldest industrially registered organisation representing the waste industry anywhere in the world. So there'll be a dinner on the 14th of June at Kirribilli Club to celebrate that. So we have 185 members across New South Wales and the ACT. They own about 90% of the commercially available vehicles for collection of waste and recyclables across New South Wales and the ACT. And in most cases, wherever a council contracts out its waste or its recyclables, it does so to a WCRA member. Tendering is very, very highly specialised activity. It's very competitive, very high cost of capital. I don't think there are any more than about 8 or 9 contractors across the whole of Australia now that have the capability to tender on a large domestic contract. Whenever a tender is advertised, it costs the tenderer a minimum of about $50,000 to put together a bid. And you know, if there are 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 bidders, as there often is, there'll only be one winner in the end, and for those that run second, there are no prizes for running second. That $50,000 is not recoverable. We support the various documents that the association and that local government have developed with the EPA to make tendering more streamlined over the years. So there's the EPA model contracts document, and by the time I get to the end of this presentation, I'll probably prove to you or come to the conclusion that that document needs reviewing. But at the moment, it is what it is, and if it needs fine-tuning, well, it needs fine-tuning, but better to fine-tune it than start from a blank sheet of paper. We also support the notion that all parties that follow the EPA's recommended service timelines when completing a tender, and I'll show you a couple of slides as to what we think that means. And to maximise safe work health and safety outcomes, as a minimum, all tenderers should comply with the Domestic Waste Code of Practice. So all of these documents have been developed in conjunction with the EPA, or at the time as they're known as the New South Wales Department of Environment and Climate Change. There were local government representatives, local government association, or as they were at the time known, Local Government Shire Association and Shires of New South Wales, WCRA representative, Safe Work New South Wales, as they were known at the time, WorkCover, and in relation to the Domestic Waste Code of Practice, very importantly, the Transport Workers Union had a lot to say at the time. We also need to be cognisant in these bids, and local government needs to be cognisant in these tender bids of meeting the EPA and the New South Wales Government's targets for waste avoidance through the waste avoidance and resource recovery targets across the state. And in recent times, with recent announcements from China and with 1 million tonnes of waste travelling up and down the highway, I saw a couple of grubby-looking trucks on my lunch break today at the front there. I showed them to you on my mobile phone if I had time, but it's become more and more difficult and more problematic to know whether we were going to come in on these targets. And there's a story in one of the environmental magazines earlier this week that confirmed that there's 975,000 tonnes of waste going from the Sydney metropolitan area to Queensland. So in relation to the EPA's timeline document, we say that 3 months beforehand that there should be a draft document developed, that the parties should be invited to have a look at that document. There should be a review of the documents, and wherever possible, if the council can make adjustments on the basis of the consultation and the review and the material they've had back and the feedback they've had back, and that can be incorporated into the tender, that'd be a good thing. Once the tender's advertised, you've got to allow sufficient time for the tenderers to put a bid in. I may be a bit ambitious with my 12 to 14 weeks, but that is what's preferred. Time is good. The more time you've got to be able to put these bids together, it will ensure that tenders are not going to be rushed. You don't want rushed responses. Rushed responses result in problems. If contractors have to guess at things or make estimates, they will generally make estimates on the high side. Anyone who's pricing risk will always price risk at a higher factor than if they can come in on an actual number that they can budget with certainty or tender with certainty. Tenders should avoid holiday periods such as Christmas. Haven't seen one of those for a couple of years, but there was a few years back when we saw a proliferation of tenders that were advertised in the lead up to Christmas or around the Christmas time. That's not a good thing because, contractors' staff have to have holidays. Remember, there are only a limited number of equipment suppliers in this country. There are only two major manufacturers of truck bodies and compaction bodies in Superior, Pack and Booker. There are only a limited number of bin suppliers. There are only a limited number of cab chassis that will fit that equipment. So we really also need to coordinate when tenders are coming out. So if you've got a big tender that is coming out at a particular time, it'd be a good thing to avoid that tender, or to avoid that tender time. Clarity in all aspects of tendering and specifications, again, will lead to better certainty, better pricing. Tendering that's costly, we can't afford for there to be a mistake. If there's a mistake made or an unfortunate omission, then the parties may have to live with that all the way through the contract. Compliance with the Domestic Waste Code of Practice, that should be shown to elected councillors. Elected councillors really are only interested in one thing, and that's getting re-elected. The association's long held the view that safety of the drivers, safety of the workers, safety of the members of the public is far more paramount than the trivial noise complaint of residents. But elected councillors want to get re-elected, so involve them in the safety discussion. So some councils don't always use these documents that I've talked about in the manner in which they're intended. And it could be that they don't begin the planning process early enough, or that, God forbid, consultants steer them in a different direction and away from those documents. And that's not being critical. There could be good reasons for that, but that does happen from time to time. Or there could be too much of a focus on the noise complaints of residents. And in a moment, I'm going to show you an unfortunate incident that took place. And one complaint, probably the biggest complaint that I get back as feedback from our members, is that council staff are often lacking in the experience to assess the waste tendering bids that come through. That is the biggest complaint that the association gets from its members, is that local government teams that are assessing these tenders don't have the skills and the experience to do a proper assessment. And there could be other reasons. So the example I'm going to share with you has got a sad ending. So the council was the Northern Beaches Council. They advertised their tender on the 19th of December in the year 2000X. It was a 5-year tender. I've changed the names and the dates to protect the names of the innocent. The collection time used to be 5 a.m. on that whole contract. And in the advertised tender, they moved it to 7 a.m. There were no risk assessments, there were no consultation, there was no compliance with the Domestic Waste Code of Practice. It's a top 10 council. They received 3 bids. The existing contractor refused to put a bid in because of the risks involved, because the existing contractor is always can be in a position of disadvantage in that the existing contractor knows the risks. In this case, the existing contractor knew that to perform the job safely, they needed to be able to commence the collections with a 5 a.m. start. So the councillors have pressured the staff. They've mandated a 7 a.m. bid. The existing contractor failed to put a bid in. The TWU and the association commenced proceedings in the New South Wales Industrial Relations Commission. Safe Work or Work Cover were co-opted into the proceedings. They sent a barrister along and exempted themselves from the proceedings. They didn't want to get involved, which was a bit disappointing, because with the involvement of Work Cover, there may have been a chance that the principles of the Domestic Waste Code of Practice could have been enforced. They walked away from it. The contract commenced. The question here is, did the ratepayers on that council, obtain the best price, the best service, and the best environmental outcome? you may be able to tick a couple of boxes there, but the one box that's ticked very, very badly is that earlier this year, very sadly, there was a fatality on that contract. It involved a pedestrian. The coroner is now investigating, and one of the key questions that will be asked of the parties is, did the revised mandated start time play a role in that incident, in that fatality? So I'll leave that question, and regrettably it's happened, and maybe in a future forum we can see where that matter ends up. Householders are the customer. Householders are the ratepayer. Householders pay a contribution to council for their bin services. They are the ultimate customer. They want a timely service. They want a user-friendly service. They want an adequate provision of all waste types that are generated by the household. We often, talk about contamination rates, in the bin with the yellow lid. Giving a resident a 120 litre bin with a red lid does nothing for contamination in the bin with the yellow lid system. So residents want an adequate provision of all waste types. They want a cost-effective service. They want to participate in resource recovery, and they want an assurance that recycling is not a sham. And we're seeing more and more of this being played out through the media as we speak at the moment. They don't want an overemphasis on price, but they want, they want to have the best recycling outcomes for themselves. But council and the contractors need to take a step back. They want to be able to provide the best education that they can to their residents to minimise and lower those contamination rates. They want to be able to ensure that the material is going to a MRF that has got good sorting capabilities, and they want to ensure that the material is not going to be overly exposed to the commodity markets. Again, all issues that are being played out at the moment. And, if the one thing that the China decision has taught us, it's that, price isn't the answer. Going with the lowest cost option isn't the answer. If you allow contracts, to go to the lowest price, then we can expect some of the poor outcomes that we've currently all facing, that we're all debating. Because that's all it's been. China has been taking waste at the lowest cost. As I said, the waste has gone from Australia and other jurisdictions to the lowest cost option. So the relationship between price and better recycling outcomes is very, very evident. You can't deliver better education, and you can't have lower contamination rates if the price is on the low side. A higher price is really required for better sorting outcomes at MRFs, and we can't expect MRFs to survive on the commodity markets. The exposure to commodity markets, it's just so volatile. It can go from, you can go from being a zero or a minus to making money. We understand that, and I think risk sharing is probably the way to go for contracting in the future, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But we have to understand that recycling contracts also include the MRF. And the MRF want quality inputs, they want lower contamination rates, they want lower compaction rates on collection. They're going to need a higher price for better sorting at MRFs. That's an absolute fact. We're hearing that around about $1 to $2 per service is probably going to be the amount of money that's going to be required to make recycling survive and thrive in this country. We really need to address a few of the other issues that are at the moment, like close the loop on glass. MRFs are under significant pressure with glass, and governments have to start mandating its use. And MRFs are also under significant pressure with regulations to do with stockpile limits and financial assurances, all matters that may not have been exposures that MRFs had in previous eras or previous contracts. So long term, most contracts are a 7 to 10 year term. There's a high cost of capital, a high cost of setup, and the recent events, with revised EPA regulations to do with authorised amounts on stockpile limits and financial assurances, and the introduction of the CDS and the current recycling crisis that we're facing have proven one thing, that the current contracts that we've got have got limited options within the contract to facilitate a proper and formal renegotiation of the contract between the parties. So given that these contracts are normally of a 7 to 10 year term and there are limited options within the contracts to facilitate a proper and formal renegotiation, there needs to be a mechanism for renegotiation, and I think the time is really now upon us, where there needs to be a mechanism formally built into the contract for a renegotiation between the parties to address unforeseen conditions, unforeseen circumstances and events that are out of the ordinary. Risk is best managed if risk is shared, and we're going to achieve the best outcomes and the best value and the best customer service if risk is transferred or transferable between the parties. We're in challenging times, and it's time for parties to now all agree with the EPA to review the EPA's model collection contract. The end of the contract is nigh, and what can the existing incumbent best hope for? Well, the existing contractor will always say he's done a great job and that his team has done a wonderful job and the service standards are known and the tender is out and the bids are all being lodged, and there'll always be a cheaper option and a different service standard, and there'll always be a non-conforming bid from someone who's not really sure of the circumstances, and the review's on and the options are before council and everything's being considered. And what can the incumbent best hope for? Well, the incumbent can best hope that experienced council staff will utilise the evaluation criteria, and price should never be any more than 30%. And all other criteria, service, work health and safety, equipment, procedures, account for the rest of the review, and a rigorous review is undertaken before the contract is awarded. And just some quick closing thoughts. The assessment team should always include a person with operational experience. The assessment team should include someone who's very, very familiar with financial costings in an operational sense. Council should verify the number of vehicles required to render the service, to provide the service levels that council are requesting. Councils should be supplying more of the operational information to reduce the amount of duplicated effort required from all of the tenderers. And if a preferred non-conforming tender is significantly different to this advertised tender, then the whole process should possibly be scrapped and the tender re-advertised. So I'm not sure that you necessarily agree with any of those closing thoughts. They're just thoughts for discussion. And thank you.